This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're diving into the game of Ty Voit, in my opinion, one of the forgotten prospects in the Maple Leafs organization. And well, that's because he basically didn't play at all last season. He played 5 games in the ECHL and not even a full game in the American League before his season was done due to season-ending shoulder surgery. This is a guy that before last season was on a lot of people's radars after coming off of a 105-point season with the OHL Sarnia Sting. And things just went terribly for him last season in terms of the injury department. Coming into this season, he has the full training camp, he has the full preseason to kind of build up and hopefully start the season running with the Marlies. So let's look back at what happened last season. For starters, it began at the prospect tournament before the preseason training camp, all of that stuff in September. He had a shoulder injury that took a while to rehab from, and he didn't end up making his season debut until December 1st. So he's already missing training camp, preseason, and the first couple of months of the first professional season of his career. Makes that debut on December 1st with the Newfoundland Growlers on essentially a conditioning stint, getting 5 games at the ECHL level before coming back up to the Marlies roster. And he was very good with the Growlers, kind of showed that he was clearly above that level in terms of his skill and being able to produce at the professional ranks, despite kind of his 5'9", 150-pound size. Had an assist in his debut, 3 assists in his second game, ended up having 2 goals, 6 assists for 8 points in those 5 games before he got recalled back to the Toronto Marlies roster. And when he got into the Marlies lineup, it didn't last very long at all. He made his AHL debut on December 20th against the Providence Bruins. He went awkwardly into the sideboards and boom, there went his shoulder. Torn shoulder labrum, season-ending surgery, and in fact, the rehab process was so long that Ty Voit said that he didn't even start skating and start that kind of process until a handful of weeks before the prospect showdown a few weeks ago before the start of training camp this season. We haven't seen Ty Voit in the preseason with the Maple Leafs at all. It's not really a surprise considering where he's coming off of. He got into 1 game over the weekend at the prospect showdown. So we still are kind of waiting to see what the situation is going to be for Ty Voit going into this season. We expect him to be on the Marlies roster, but due to the lack of game time and a lot of bodies kind of being on the roster, it's kind of a question of where he actually fits on that roster. And it's a situation where after a pretty significant lost season, and this is a guy that already missed an entire season due to COVID back in 2020-21, he didn't play in his draft year. That's essentially 2 seasons of his development pretty much gone entirely at just 21 years old. So for Ty Voit, this is a very important season coming up. He's got to find his groove again. He's got to prove that he can produce at the American League level, be a good guy on the power play, good scorer, all those elements, while also kind of improving his strength and kind of that element as well. Unfortunately, coming into training camp, just because he missed so much time, like when you have a shoulder injury, there's not really a lot of strength training and stuff that you can really do to try and build up that weight. So for a player that was listed at, I think, 157 pounds in last year's training camp, he actually lost 2 pounds going into camp this year at like 155, which I know a lot of people kind of looked at and was like, what is going on here? Voit missed so much time due to injury that I'm putting the entire year aside and looking to this year as essentially his first year pro and seeing what he can do. And looking back to what he did in the OHL, it was so impressive. He was drafted in 2021, as I mentioned, 5th round, 153rd overall after not playing at all that season. The year prior, as an OHL rookie in his draft -1 season, he had 8 goals, 28 points in 49 games. So he comes back 2 years after that, after missing the COVID year in 2021 with the Sting, puts up 26 goals, 80 points in 67 games. A very impressive season, kind of putting his name on the radar as a legit prospect to watch as one of those mid-round guys. In his final season of junior, he put up 24 goals, 105 points in 67 games. As I mentioned, the first Maple Leafs prospect to have a 100-point season in the OHL since Mitch Marner. And of course, Marner did it in his Draft Plus One season. Voit did it a year older, but there's actually kind of some similarities in the way that the two play as kind of playmakers first, really a wide array of tricks in terms of the way that they can create plays and pass and all of those sorts of things. Of course, very, very astronomically different levels of players. But when you watch Ty Voit play, you can kind of look at it and see there's some Mitch Marnerisms to his game. But the main knock on Ty Voit is the 155-pound frame, 5'9", not really being a guy that you can play on a fourth, maybe even third line in certain circumstances. Very much still a boom or bust prospect. So coming into this season with the Marlies, I'm excited to see what he can do. There's a lot of guys that are intriguing fits alongside of him in terms of some shooters that he could work with as primarily a very impressive playmaker, and some guys that he could work well with on the power play as well. So I'm very excited now to get to my conversation with somebody that's liked Ty Voit's game for a few years now and is just like me, waiting to see what he can do at the professional level. Very excited to get to my conversation now with Tony Ferrari, all about Ty Voit. Very excited to be joined now by Tony Ferrari to talk all about, I think, one of the more underrated or forgotten Leafs prospects right now, Ty Voit. Tony, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, happy to join you. It's certainly one of the most intriguing prospects in the Leafs system.
Yeah, and we talk about the intrigue or maybe the forgotten factor because Ty Voit barely played last year, had the 5 ECHL games on kind of a conditioning stint, played barely one AHL game before sustaining a season-ending shoulder injury, and that was after sustaining an injury earlier in the prospect tournament as well. So he only basically played 5.5 games of pro hockey last year, all in December. It's very easy to kind of overlook Voit coming into this season, but a big training camp upcoming and a big second pro season coming up for Ty Voit. I think it's best to kind of go back to his last season in the OHL first and kind of start on a positive before we get into some of the injury stuff from last season. His last season in Sarnia was obviously spectacular. 105 points. He's the only Leafs prospect to score over 100 points in the OHL since Mitch Marner. Easton Cowan didn't quite hit that total last year, so Voit still gets to hold that one on him. But what did you make of Voit in his OHL career? I know you were a fan going back to his draft year. He was one of those weird COVID draft year guys, but what did you make of Voit when he was back with the Sarnia Sting a couple years ago?
I think the biggest thing with Ty Voit is he's an exceptional playmaker. There are very few players in recent years in the prospect world who are able to come up with the creative passes, to see the lanes that he sees, and just understand how to manipulate pressure the way he does. He's an undersized guy. I'm sure we'll get to that when we talk about some of the injuries from last year and some of the concerns going forward, but he really doesn't shy away from having bigger defenders come in on him and accepting that pressure and really just using it to his advantage, whether it's opening up a lane along the wall so he can pass the puck down the boards or finding a seam to the center ice. There's so many things that he does just to make that little pass. And one of the things I always look towards in prospects is, are they able to chain small plays together? And while we all see Voigt's highlight reel, we all see the big plays he makes and the exceptional passes, the fancy dekes and dangles that he has. It's that ability to chain small passes together, small plays together, and come up with a bigger play that ends up being something that maybe he's not even on the score sheet because of, but he was one that either started the play or he got things going off the wall. There's those little things that he does really well. And I think he showed that in his last year in the OHL. And as little as we saw him last year, you did see moments of that in the ECHL. So I'm excited for this upcoming season. Health permitting, I think he's going to have a really good year in the AHL.
Yeah, and so going back to the draft year, obviously very weird career to this point. And one of those players that is kind of in that COVID weird era where his draft year was completely erased in the OHL. So people were drafting off of his draft -1 season where he had 28 points with Sarnia. He comes back after the COVID year, puts up 80 points, of course, ends his OHL career with 105 points. How did you see Voigt's game kind of evolve or develop over his career in the OHL?
I think the biggest thing was just his ability to deal with some of the physicality, deal with some of the pressure. He is an undersized guy. Now he's listed at 5'10", but I think in his draft year, he was right around 5'7" or 5'8". So it wasn't like he was this big guy out there on the ice. He was always the smallest guy on the ice. He was always the one having to maneuver out of problems and find his way out of pressure. And seeing him able to do that now that he has gotten to what is becoming a bit more of an average height in the NHL at 5'10", you're like, okay, now there's actual potential for him to be a pro player. At 5'7", at 5'8", you're really hoping he grows, or you're really hoping he's an exceptional player. At 5'10", there's a little bit more room. Maybe he does play an energy role down the lineup with that playmaking being such a big upside and becoming a power play option. But it's that kind of concern of his size continuing to translate at the next level that you had during his draft year and during his D-1, because like you said, the COVID year really messed up a lot of players. We're still seeing the effects of that. Guys like Nick Robertson, Shane Wright, many players from that draft class, unless their name's Wyatt Johnston. It's a really weird draft class. It's a really weird year. And I think we're going to see a lot of these guys really blossom at 22, 23, 24 over the next couple of years after we've all called them busts for a couple of years first.
Yeah, and so you mentioned kind of that delayed development for a lot of these guys, with, of course, the exception of Johnston, because of that entire missed year for a lot of guys playing in the CHL. Of course, there were some players playing in Quebec or the Western League that got a few games. The Ontario guys had nothing, and the draft scouts were going off of showcase games held around different places or off of draft -1 tape. And so Voit is that kind of guy that is coming through. That was at the time seen as kind of a home run swing type draft pick in the 5th round. And we've seen glimpses of it, of course, in the OHL. We were hoping to see it last year at the professional ranks. And of course, due to injury, we don't see it. Looking at some of the younger players and those kind of, I don't want to say all offense players, but the players that are the smaller, lighter players that build their game around the playmaking elements. What is the biggest challenge of taking and translating that offense from the OHL ranks and making that adjustment to the AHL and eventually the NHL? Because we saw last year, or we didn't get to see last year, Voit get that transition. And so we're going to see what he can do taking that 100-point OHL season to the AHL, hopefully this upcoming year, seeing if he can remain healthy, of course.
I think the biggest thing for players like Voit and those all offense players, the guys that put up big numbers that are a little bit undersized at the OHL or CHL level in general, is dealing with the physicality, especially at the AHL level. People don't give it credit. It is probably a more physical league than the NHL in terms of body checking and guys chasing hits and trying to put on a show. They're trying to get up to the NHL. They're trying to get there any way they can. So you have guys chasing down hits. You have guys trying to just give you that extra shot in the corners and stuff. And that's going to be the things that Ty Voigt's going to have to deal with and maneuver through and learn to kind of grow through. As an undersized guy, he's going to have to stay healthy. That's always been the biggest thing with Ty Voit, is can he stay healthy when things get faster, stronger, bigger, and just overall more physical. Last year, unfortunately, there was a weird hit, and that kind of sent him into the boards, tore his labrum, and ended his season early. This year's a fresh start, though. He needs to get out there, show that he doesn't need to go out there and throw hits. He doesn't need to go out there and win every board battle even, but show that he can be a functional player along the boards, show that he can use the intelligence that he has, because he's a really smart player, to position himself well, get on the right side of the puck, maneuver your way out of problems instead of trying to push your way out of problems the way a lot of bigger guys are able to. Those are the things that he's going to have to translate to the next level. And I think he has the ability to do it. It's just going to be about doing it at a faster pace, as the AHL and NHL both are. The pro game is a lot faster than the junior ranks. We talk about it all the time when guys jump from any of the CHL leagues, particularly right to the NHL. There's always that adjustment period, it seems. So even a guy like Ty Voit jumping to the AHL, there's going to be an adjustment period. I think it's going to be a bit tough for him at first, but I think we're going to see a pretty good season from him.
Yeah, getting more into the impacts of the injury now on kind of his career as a whole right now. He missed his age 17 season due to the COVID cancellation. He now misses his age 20 season due to injuries. Of course, playing 5.5 games doesn't really count for too much. How concerning is that for you, looking at kind of the development as a whole, missing those 2 significant seasons at such a young age?
It's tough. It really is. I think any player that misses a big chunk like that in those prime development years, I've talked to many people around hockey, both in the public and the private side, and they always say between the ages of 16, 17, and 22 are kind of when the player develops. That's when they become the player they are. We've seen it so many times. There's players that get drafted and they're like, well, if they just change the way they play, players don't change the way they play. let's be honest. A lot of times players don't change the style that they play for the most part. They're the same player that they were at junior hockey. They may refine things, they may round things out, but Tim Stützle is still the guy that went 100 miles per hour in the DEL. The Lucas Raymond's still the tactical guy that was playing over in Sweden. And I expect Ty Voit to still be that exceptional creative playmaker that he was in the OHL. Yes, there's going to be refinement. Yes, there's going to be things like that. But missing 2 years of playing time in those prime development years is big. It's there's no doubt about it. COVID, you couldn't do anything about that. That was a global thing that everyone had to deal with. The injury, obviously not his fault, but it's really unfortunate. Thankfully, he's not this exceptional goal scorer. I think labrum injuries certainly affect shooting a little bit more than passing, but there are going to be moments where he's trying to make one of those creative plays where he tries to do a hook pass around somebody or he tries to squeak by somebody on the board and maybe he gets hit in that shoulder and maybe he's a little bit sore or something. These injuries don't heal overnight. Even though he's had basically almost a year to heal, you're still a little bit wary whenever you go back into action. So it's going to be interesting to see how he bounces back and how he really performs at training camp, because we're going to see him in preseason games, I think at least one or two at the start, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, you mentioned the physical recovery. The mental recovery is just as big a part of it as well. Going into those corners against, especially in the AHL, a lot of really big hulking defensemen who some of them are 30 plus years old as well. And part of it is, of course, just being physically ready, but that mental challenge is going to be a hurdle to overcome as well. The lack of size and the shoulder injury, part of it is a little bit fluky, just kind of the way that he went into the boards after already hurting. I believe it was the same shoulder earlier in prospect tournament. Is that something that is a worry going forwards, a bit of a trend there, or is that something that you still are willing to put aside and just kind of look as a fluky incident that was an unfortunate reality and that this isn't really a worry going forwards at this point?
For me, I'm willing to put it aside this time. You look at other players around the league. I think Nick Robertson's a really good example of this, who plays a million miles an hour, goes into the boards head first with no awareness of who's around him. And sometimes he gets pummeled into the boards. And Nick Robertson's dealt with a bunch of injuries because of that. I think we're starting to see Robertson become a little bit more aware of his surroundings when he goes into those battles, when he kind of goes into the boards. And that's what I'm looking to see from Ty Voit now. Don't get injured 3 times and then hopefully you figure it out then. Get injured the one time, understand that you need to grow from that. Watch a bunch of tape. Like, this guy was out of hockey for a long time. He's mentioned at the rookie tournament that he's watched a ton of tape. He was around the guys all the time. He was trying to make sure that he stayed within the element of hockey. So I think that's going to be important to him. And I think, just like you said, that mental awareness, the mental recovery and getting back to what he was and playing his game at the end of the day is going to be the most important thing for him.
And so we talk about playing his game and looking to what could be an NHL future for Ty Voit as this kind of undersized, skilled, creative playmaker. At this point, he's still that kind of boomer bust type prospect. What do you characterize his potential in the NHL to look at?
I think if he reaches his ceiling, he's a middle six scoring winger who has a stat line somewhere around 10 goals, 30, 40 assists, maybe at the best of times. I think he's a guy that's certainly going to get way more assists than he's going to have goals. I don't think he's ever going to be much of a goal scorer. Maybe he challenges 20 goals if he hits his ceiling, but he's not really going to be that scoring threat. On the power play, I think he can be, you could put him at the top of the umbrella, really, if you're not worrying about his defensive game. Like, his ability to operate in extra space, manipulate players, understand how to work off his edges and just make these little moves, the shoulder fakes. He does so many of those little things well, that I think he could be on a power play this year running an AHL power play. So it's going to be really interesting to see that element of his game. But yeah, I don't know if he ever gets top line upside. At the end of the day, like you said, he's a boomer bust guy. He's not a guy that is going to play on the fourth line. Even if you're certainly looking for a third line that's going to go out and crash and bang, Ty Voigt's not your guy. He's a modern day third line guy who's out there to score. I think the NHL's moved to this scoring third line so much more over the last decade or two that he's the guy that fits into that mold. He's still got to get there. He's still got a lot of room to grow at the AHL level. And this year's going to be a big step for him because he needs to play a full season, I think. an injury where he misses 1 or 2 games, I'm not worried about that. But if there's another moment of, hey, he's out for the season or he's out for 3 months, that's when you start to worry about a guy like this.
Yeah, and talking about if he hits any kind of ceiling like that, especially due to the injury and missing that COVID year as well, you're looking at an extended timeline of that as
Yeah.
well. And if you were maybe at one point projecting Ty Voit to push for NHL minutes at like 23, 24 years old, maybe you're looking at that potentially coming at like 25 years old. And depending on how the seasons go, of course, we'll see how everything plays out in that regard, but definitely seems like if he's ever going to become an NHLer, it's in a definitely modern third line type role where he's getting some significant power play usage because as we've kind of talked about and a little bit here, the creativity and playmaking that he showed in Sarnia was spectacular at some times. And so getting into the kind of standout and best traits of Voigt's game, it's of course it's a little bit awkward going back what's essentially a year and a half, 2 years now for this player because we didn't get to see him play much last year. What were the things that stood out when he was back with Sarnia as kind of the key attributes that make him such an exciting prospect?
His ability to manipulate off the top is the biggest thing for me. The way he's able to use shoulder fakes, use little deeks and dangles, the way he's able to place the puck out to the side to draw a player that way so that he can make a pass the other way. Those little things, incredibly impressive. Those are things you want to see from a guy like this. But the thing that I really notice about Ty Voigt's game is he's able to make just about every pass you can think of. You want to see backhand saucer passes, he's able to make that. You want to see a crisp cross ice pass right on the ice, he's able to do that. He's a guy that can pass from blue line to blue line. He's able to go high to low, different things. He's able to make passes from while handling the puck in his feet or well out extended. Like I said, whether it's a backhand or forehand, he's able to find teammates all over the ice. A lot of times you go, there's this player on a right-handed center is often passing to his left. He's a little bit more comfortable passing that way. You don't have to worry about that with Ty Voit. He's able to pass all over the ice. He's not going to neglect one side of the ice because it's on his backhand or because he's not facing that direction or anything like that. He's able to simply find teammates in areas that those teammates sometimes aren't even expecting. I don't even know how many times I've seen a player in the OHL when he was playing there get a pass right on their tape and almost look surprised, like, oh, I didn't, there's no way he was getting me that puck. And then they did, and then the guy scores. So he makes those guys around him a lot better. He makes their life easier by drawing a lot of that pressure. And those are the things you really look forward to seeing in a guy like this, because if he can do this at the AHL level, then you start to gain hope of maybe he's the next Bobby McMahon, obviously not the same stylistically, but that guy that comes in at 25, 26, 27 and fills a hole in the lineup when you're like, we needed somebody there.
And so on the flip side of that, what are the areas that are in most need of improvement? What are the key areas that Voit will have to develop from his OHL days? Because again, we don't have really the tape from last year to really go off of. What are the key areas that you want to see improvement in if he's to ever make that impact in the NHL?
Find a way to get blown up less. Just be a little bit more aware along the boards. I understand he's not going to ever be the guy throwing big hits, but there were times in Sarnia where you saw him get hit a lot, like heavy. And it wasn't something like he was getting blown up every single game, but when he did get hit, he seemed to get blown up.
Yeah.
And that's something I want to see him kind of work out of his game. And the other thing, just try defensively, just once in a while. Sometimes he was letting everyone else do the work defensively and skating along the blue line and catching the intercept and intercepting a pass when it goes defend D to D or something like that. So he has the ability to do it. He reads the play really well. There's just sometimes a little bit of a lack of effort defensively.
Yeah, and the effort defensively and kind of those elements, I'm really intrigued to see this year, again, assuming health, because it's one thing to be the 100-point scorer on an OHL team that's not really putting in the effort defensively because you know you're going to make it up on the offensive side. It's a very different thing if you're in a pro environment and you're playing third line minutes, let's say, and you're battling to earn coaches' trust to get in more offensive situations. You're more likely to put in that effort in certain situations that maybe you weren't at the junior level, which makes the evaluation for Voit right now going into training camp so fascinating because we didn't get to see it last year, and he also didn't play junior last year. So it's a very interesting mix. And like we said off the top, one of the more fascinating, intriguing players coming into Maple Leafs training camp just because there's so many unknowns when it comes to his game. going off of the unknown factor, what are your expectations for Voigt this season? It's a real tough question that I've thought about, and I really don't know myself because of that last season. We don't have a sample of what he looks like in the OHL, except for a couple minutes that he got in that first period of that one game. He looked great in his ECHL games, but again, that's a big difference between going from the ECHL to the AHL as well. What are your expectations for Voigt in what is essentially his first year as a pro, but his second year in totality with the Marlies?
It's really tough to gauge. Like you said, he hasn't played in a year, basically, aside from a few games. I would love to see Voigt be around that point 0.6, 0.7 points per game mark at the AHL level. Maybe if he gets into 60 games, I'd love to see him play or score 35, 40 points. I'd love to see him put up 25, 30 assists. I think those are realistic numbers for a guy who has that power play utility, who has that offensive ability. And yeah, there are probably going to be times where his coach isn't trusting him to necessarily play on the power play or play at 5-on-5. But sometimes coaches are like, we're down a goal. We need somebody out there that can get it, because they score another goal. It's not going to change the way the win or loss column. But if we score one, it might. So he's going to get his opportunities, I think. And he's a guy that I think 35 to 40 points is pretty realistic for an expectation for a guy like this.
Yeah, the Marlies are a pretty deep roster coming into the season. I'm fascinated to see who he ends up playing with, where he lines up on the roster. Part of my mind always goes back to that Sam Gagner season where he played on like the fourth line, but then racked up a bunch of points on the power play, and think that could potentially be a role for Ty Voit this year as he gets comfortable, at least in the early going. But yeah, I'm fascinated to see how things go, because like you said, even if he's playing third, fourth line minutes at 5-on-5, you got to expect that he's going to be one of the key players on the power play this upcoming season. And so we talk about the expectations for him. And to wrap up here, I guess, what does a successful season look like for Ty Voit? Like, what is kind of the bar for you between obviously the expectations that you have for him, but what is kind of that successful season? What are kind of the goals for Ty Voit to hit this upcoming season?
I think the first thing is to stay healthy. That's the obvious one, really. Just stay healthy, get in 45, 50 games at the AHL level if you can. And I think true success for him this year is don't play ECHL games. Like, don't go down. Like, force your way into the lineup. Make sure that John Gruden and the Marlies coaching staff is playing you because you're one of the best players that they have. Keep showing that your utility on the power play. Keep showing the playmaking that you have. And like you said, work harder on the defensive end, because now you have to. Now you're not the star. Now you got to go out there and earn every shift you get. And I think that would be a successful season. I'd love to see the points. I'd love to see 40 points, maybe even more. I'd love to see 30, 35 assists. But really, I just want to see Ty Voit stay healthy, start to look comfortable at the AHL level, playing against men, and deal with that physicality and force your way into the lineup every single night if you can.
Tony, thanks for jumping on here to talk about Ty Voit. I know it's a curious case where we had to go back a couple years in the vault and bring back some of the Sarnia memories, but thanks for jumping on. Let everybody know where we can find your work and plug anything on the site if you have it as well.
Yeah, you can find all my work at thehockeynews.com and follow me on Twitter or X at the Tony Ferrari. All my prospect stuff for prospects and the NHL draft will all be there.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for taking the time, and looking forward to the content this upcoming season.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Camp Countdown. Thanks again to Tony for jumping on to talk all about Ty Voit. We got a lot of fun episodes coming up soon, diving into the NHL roster. And of course, this is going to go past the actual start of the NHL season, some rebranding in the plans, but a lot of fun shows coming up over the next few weeks. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.